The lights flickered, a cold draft snaked through the room, and then a scream, sharp, terrified, echoing through the empty corridors of Blackwood Manor. When they burst into the room, they found her, motionless, eyes wide with unspeakable horror, clutching a single torn page, a page that should never have existed, a page that held a secret someone was willing to kill for. But the real question was, who would be next? Tuppence had barely stepped into the office when she froze mid-motion, her brow furrowing at the peculiar sight before her. Tommy stood rigid, his eye fixed intently on the hidden peephole that overlooked the outer office. His posture, unusually still, set off warning bells in her mind. "What on earth?" she began, but he cut her off with a swift, urgent gesture. "She," his barely moving his lips. The buzzer went off. "It's a woman, a rather striking one, if I may say so. There's something about her, an air of urgency, perhaps even fear. Albert's feeding her the usual nonsense about me being locked in consultation with Scotland Yard." Intrigued, Tuppence stepped closer. "Let me see." Tommy hesitated but grudgingly moved aside. She pressed her eye to the peephole, observing the woman seated outside, a vision of elegance and distress. The stranger's fingers drummed anxiously against the handle of a sleek black handbag. "Not bad," Tuppence conceded, tilting her head slightly, "and well dressed. That coat must have come straight from Paris." "She's more than just not bad," Tommy murmured, almost to himself. "There's something about her, a quiet desperation, like one of those tragic heroines Mason writes about. Intelligent, but not too shrewd. Vulnerable, but not weak." His expression shifted suddenly, determination snapping into place. "I shall be the great Hanno today," Tuppence snorted. "If there's any detective you resemble the least, it's Hanno. Can you shift personalities on a whim? Be the fool, the scholar, the confident, all in the span of a breath." Tommy merely smirked, rapping his knuckles against the desk. "I am the captain of this ship, dear Tuppence, and don't you forget it." With a flourish, he pressed the buzzer. Albert entered, nodding briskly before ushering the woman inside. She paused at the threshold, her eyes scanning the room, as though weighing an invisible threat. Tommy stepped forward, his voice smooth, reassuring. "Do come in, mademoiselle. Please sit." From the corner of her eye, Tuppence caught the faint twitch of his lips, a smirk barely suppressed. She coughed pointedly, but Tommy ignored her. Instead, he fixed the woman with an earnest gaze. "No need for formalities, just tell me everything, from the beginning. We shall find a way to help you." The woman hesitated, then exhaled slowly, gathering her courage. "You are very kind," she murmured. Then with an inquisitive tilt of her head, she asked, "Are you a foreigner?" Tuppence choked back a laugh, disguising it with a sudden fit of coughing. Tommy's eyes flicked toward her, dangerously narrowed. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice betraying only the faintest irritation. "But my methods are not conventional. I have worked extensively abroad. My training is rooted in the precision of the sûreté." "Oh," the woman breathed, seemingly impressed. She was, as Tommy had so astutely noted, strikingly beautiful, slender, with a refined elegance. Her golden hair glinted under the dim office light, peeking from beneath a smartly tilted hat. But it was her eyes that held Tuppence's attention, large dark pools of worry, shifting ever so slightly, as though she feared something or someone might appear at any moment. Her fingers twisted anxiously, fidgeting with the clasp of her lacquer red handbag. "First of all, Mr. Blunt," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "my name is Vivian Hargrove. I have come because," she swallowed hard, "because last night in my home, something terrible happened." Tuppence stepped into the dimly lit office, her brow furrowing as she caught sight of Tommy, eyes fixed intently on the peephole leading to the outer room. "What on earth?" she began, but Tommy silenced her with a quick motion of his hand. "Chess," the buzzer went off. "There's a girl out there, an interesting one, I'd say. She's got that look, intelligent but troubled, the kind that walks into a detective's office when things have gone terribly wrong." His voice was laced with curiosity. Tuppence, intrigued despite herself, leaned in to take a look. "Not bad," she admitted, noting the girl's sharp features and the nervous way she twisted the strap of her handbag, and dressed to the nines. Definitely someone with money, or at least someone who knows how to look the part. Tommy grinned. She's perfect. A real Mason heroine, a touch of mystery, a hint of tragedy, and an undeniable air of intrigue. I feel this morning I shall be the great Poirot himself. Tuppence snorted. You, Poirot? The man is a genius of psychology. You, my dear, are barely competent at tying your shoelaces before noon. Tommy ignored her. He pressed the buzzer, and the door swung open. The girl hesitated, a shadow flickering across her delicate features. Come in, mademoiselle, Tommy said with exaggerated charm, stepping forward. Do not be afraid. We deal in problems, and problems are meant to be solved. The girl hesitated, before sitting down. My name is Evelyn Harcourt, she began, her voice soft but steady. I live at Harcourt Manor, a place with more history than comfort. I wouldn't be here if it weren't serious, Mr. Blunt. You see, someone is trying to kill me. A silence settled over the room. Tuppence glanced at Tommy, whose demeanor had shifted. He was no longer playing detective, he was one. Go on, he said. Evelyn took a shaky breath. It started with the letters, strange unsigned notes warning me to leave the house. Then the whispers. At first I thought I was imagining them, but the servants heard them too. Soft voices in the dark, speaking of death, of a curse. And then last week, the tea. Her hands clenched in her lap. I barely drank it before the pain started. The doctor said it was poisoning, arsenic to be exact. Not enough to kill, but enough to warn. Tommy's eyes gleamed. And yet you haven't gone to the police. Evelyn shook her head. I can't. The police would only see it as an accident, or worse, hysteria. But I know the truth. Someone inside that house wants me dead, and I need to know who, before they succeed. The room seemed to darken with the weight of her words. Tommy leaned back, steepling his fingers. A house filled with secrets, whispers in the dark, and a murderer who prefers slow poison over a quick knife. Yes, Miss Harcourt, you've certainly come to the right place. He glanced at Tuppence, a familiar spark of excitement in his eyes. Shall we take the case? Blackwood Manor stood in eerie solitude, its grand structure shrouded in the mist that rolled in from the moors. It was a place where silence held secrets, and shadows whispered of things long buried. The village of Blackwood was a mere speck on the map, a quiet settlement where even the smallest incident became the talk of the town. So when Eleanor Whitmore received an anonymous package, a delicate ribbon-tied box of chocolates, it was both curious and unsettling. She wasn't particularly fond of sweets, but the others in the house were. The chocolates were passed around at dinner, a gesture of hospitality that soon turned into horror. By midnight, every person who had taken a bite was writhing in pain, gripped by a strange burning sickness. The doctor was summoned, panic setting in as he examined the remains of the treats. His diagnosis was chilling: arsenic poisoning, not enough to kill, but certainly enough to warn. This was no accident, and it wasn't the first time. 2 other prominent families in Blackwood had suffered the same fate: poisoned confections, an anonymous sender, and a lingering fear that someone close to them wished them harm. The local inspector had theories: a madman with a grudge, a deranged prankster, but Eleanor knew better. The answer wasn't lurking in the village, it was inside the house, and she had proof. Among the shredded wrapping of the chocolate box, she found something that sent a shiver down her spine: a tiny, intricate doodle, 3 birds, their wings intertwined. It was a meaningless sketch, a habit of hers whenever she held a pen, something she had scribbled absent-mindedly on a label just days ago when opening a package that had never left Blackwood Manor. Someone inside her home had sent that poisoned gift, someone she dined with, spoke to, trusted, and as Eleanor locked eyes with each of them across the candle-lit dining room, she realized one terrifying truth: one of them wanted her dead. The case of the whispering shadows. The heavy rain drummed against the windows of Blackthorn Manor, a sprawling estate wrapped in mist and secrets. Inside the dimly lit drawing room, Eleanor Graves, a poised yet visibly distressed young woman, sat across from Detective Jonathan Rook. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "A box of chocolates," she whispered, her voice tight with apprehension. "It was sent by someone in this house." Jonathan leaned forward, his piercing grey eyes locking onto hers. "How can you be so certain, Miss Graves?" She inhaled sharply, steadying herself. It's simple. I have a peculiar habit. Whenever I have a pen in hand, I doodle a small insignificant pattern, 3 intertwined ivy leaves. A week ago, a package of silk scarves arrived for me from an exclusive shop in London. I was at breakfast, reading the paper, and without thinking, I scribbled my little pattern on the label before opening the parcel. I thought nothing of it, until today. When I examined the brown paper the chocolates had been wrapped in, I noticed something. A torn corner of the original label still clung to it. My ivy leaves, right there. Jonathan's expression darkened. That is no coincidence. It strongly suggests the chocolates came from within these walls. Someone here wants to harm you. Eleanor nodded grimly. Exactly. But that's not all. You may wonder why I refuse to call the police. The answer is simple. I may want this entire matter silenced. Jonathan studied her carefully. That means you already suspect someone. She hesitated. I suspect no one, and yet there are possibilities. Jonathan's mind raced. Tell me, Miss Graves, who exactly resides in this house at present? She folded her hands in her lap, composing herself before she spoke. There's the household staff, Mrs. Holloway, our long-time cook, and her niece Rose, the kitchen maid, 2 elderly housemaids, both here for years. Then there's Hannah, my late aunt's lady's maid. She's always been fiercely loyal to me. The parlour maid, Esther Quant, is fairly new but seems pleasant enough. As for the rest of us, there's Miss Logan, who was my aunt's companion, and now manages the house. Captain Victor Radcliffe, Dennis's cousin, though we've always called him just cousin. And finally, Mary Chilcott, an old school friend of mine who is staying here for a few weeks. Jonathan took a moment to process the information. You have no reason to suspect one person over another. Eleanor hesitated, then exhaled slowly. But it's not the servants I fear. Jonathan leaned back, tapping a thoughtful finger against his chin. This house, Blackthorn Manor, has a long history, doesn't it? A flicker of unease crossed Eleanor's face. Yes, my late aunt, Lady Eleanor Radcliffe, was its last true mistress. She inherited a vast fortune from her husband, who was knighted for his business acumen. He was the one who bought Blackthorn Manor, but he died just 2 years later. That's when Aunt Eleanor sent for me. I was her only living relation. She always said she would leave everything to Dennis, her husband's nephew. After all, it was Radcliffe money, and she believed it should go to a Radcliffe. But something changed. Her voice grew softer, tinged with uncertainty. Dennis disappointed her. He gambled, he made reckless choices, and a year before her death, she changed her will, left everything to me. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. And when was this? 3 weeks ago. Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Jonathan finally spoke. That is a dangerous timeline, Miss Graves. You inherited a fortune, and now someone is trying to poison you. Eleanor's fingers curled tightly around the edge of her chair. That's why I can't involve the police. If I am right, if my suspicions are even remotely true, this is a crime that needs to be handled quietly. Jonathan straightened. In that case, you'll need protection. I suggest you tell your household to expect the arrival of 2 American friends, Mr. and Miss Van Dorn. She raised a brow. And who will they really be? A ghost of a smile played on his lips. My partner and I, we will arrive tomorrow, and we will find out exactly who in this house wants you dead. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it secrets that had long been buried within Blackthorn Manor's ancient walls. But some secrets refused to stay hidden, and Jonathan Rook was determined to uncover them before it was too late. Tommy leaned forward, his expression sharp. Now give me a detailed account of everyone in the house right now, servants or others, both. She hesitated before answering, as though weighing her words. The staff have been with us for years. There's old Mrs. Holloway, our cook, and her niece Rose, the kitchen maid. 2 elderly housemaids, both quiet, loyal. Then there's Hannah. She was my aunt's maid, fiercely devoted to me. Our parlour maid, Esther Quant, is a reserved, polite girl. Among the others, there's Miss Logan, Aunt Lucy's companion, who practically runs the household now. Captain Radcliffe Dennis, whom I mentioned before, and Mary Chilcott, an old school friend, staying with us for a while. Tommy absorbed the details, then spoke carefully. And you have no particular suspicions about anyone? She shook her head. Not exactly, but I can't shake the feeling that if the truth comes out, it will point to someone close, and that thought terrifies me. Understandable. He sat back, thoughtful. There's only one way forward. I need to be there. She glanced at him, puzzled. You need to introduce some American friends, say Mr. and Miss Van Dusen. Can you do that without raising suspicion? Yes, she said firmly. It won't be difficult. Good Dodd, then we arrive tomorrow. Not a word to anyone about who we really are. She left, and Tommy turned to Tuppence, who had been listening in silence. I don't like it, she said at last. Especially the low dose of arsenic in those chocolates. What do you mean? Think about it. The chocolates sent to different houses were a distraction, a trick, a way to establish the idea of a random crazed poisoner in the area. Then when the real poisoning happened, everyone would assume it was part of the same pattern. If not for pure luck, no one would suspect the culprit was inside the house all along. Tommy exhaled sharply. So you believe the girl was the true target? I do, and the motive is obvious: inheritance. I recall reading about Lady Radcliffe's will. That girl inherited a massive fortune. Tommy's eyes darkened, and 3 weeks ago she turned 21 and made her own will, which means, Tuppence murmured, if she dies now someone else benefits. Dennis Radcliffe, Tommy said grimly. And the worst part, Tuppence leaned forward, she suspects him, but she's too in love with him to act against him. That's why she refuses to involve the police. Tommy frowned. If he wanted her money, why not just marry her? Tuppence's face went blank for a second. Then she snapped her fingers. That's it. He must already be married. Maybe a secret marriage from his Oxford days. Maybe that's what caused the fallout with his aunt. Tommy smirked. Then why not just poison the wife? That would be much simpler. Before Tuppence could answer, Tommy's expression changed. He grabbed the morning newspaper from the table, scanning the front page. What's wrong? Tuppence hurried over. He thrust the paper at her, pointing at the headline. Mysterious poisoning at Thornley Grange. Fig sandwiches claim 2 lives. Tuppence read in horror. Miss Lois Hargreaves, dead. The parlour maid, Esther Quant, dead. Captain Radcliffe and Miss Logan, gravely ill. The suspected source, fig paste in sandwiches. Mary Chilcott, the only one who hadn't eaten them, was unharmed. We need to leave. Now, Tommy said, his jaw clenched. Tuppence, pale, met his gaze. That girl was counting on us, and we let her down. Tommy grabbed his coat. If I had gone yesterday, you'd be dead too. Tuppence interrupted. You would have eaten those sandwiches. Tommy muttered a curse under his breath. Dennis Radcliffe is seriously ill. More likely pretending. The snake. They reached Thornley just past noon. The house loomed in the distance, its presence darker than ever. An elderly woman with red-rimmed eyes opened the door. Tommy acted before she could speak. We're not reporters. Miss Hargreaves asked us to come. We need to see someone. Dr. Burden, if he's here. The woman hesitated. Or Miss Chilcott. She's handling things now. But Tommy had already made up his mind. Dr. Burton. First, he said. I need the truth. The morning air was crisp, yet the atmosphere inside Ashburn Manor felt stifling with unspoken tension. A knock on the door echoed through the grand yet hollow halls. Inspector James Mercer stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the room where 3 bodies had been discovered mere hours ago. Who first noticed the deaths? He asked, his voice firm but measured. A frail housekeeper, eyes red-rimmed from shock, stepped forward hesitantly. It was Miss Eleanor, she whispered, nodding toward a pale, trembling young woman seated by the fireplace. Eleanor lifted her gaze, her expression a mixture of grief and something deeper, perhaps fear. I was in the study when I heard a crash from the dining hall, she murmured. When I rushed in they were just there, lifeless. The sandwiches were half-eaten, and the air smelled strange. Inspector Mercer knelt beside the table where the remaining sandwiches lay untouched. His fingers hovered over the delicate bread, his instincts screaming caution. Who else was here? Eleanor hesitated before answering. Dr. Langley left early, and Victor he arrived late. I don't know if he'd anything. A muscle in Mercer's jaw tightened. Where is he now? Silence. The housekeeper looked away. Eleanor swallowed hard. He's missing. The inspector exchanged a glance with his assistant, Evelyn Hunt, who scribbled furiously in her notebook. The air in the manor thickened with unease. 3 dead, 1 missing. The killer had left no room for error, except for the one person they never intended to spare. The very one who had vanished without a trace. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit drawing room. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old books and something faintly medicinal. A tall elderly man with tired eyes and a furrowed brow entered, his movements slow, burdened by unseen worries. "Dr. Alistair Burden?" inquired Ethan Graves, flashing his investigator's badge. Beside him, Olivia Hart, his keen-eyed assistant, observed the doctor's reaction. "We're here regarding the poisoned chocolates. Miss Davenport reached out to us before." He hesitated. Before it was too late, the doctor studied them sharply before nodding. "Yes, given the circumstances, I won't hold back. Initially I suspected a severe case of ptomaine poisoning, violent, unforgiving, but the symptoms were too extreme, too immediate. I had the fig paste tested." "You suspect arsenic?" Olivia asked. Dr. Burton shook his head. "No, something far deadlier. This acts fast, a botanical toxin, likely exotic, designed to be untraceable." Ethan leaned forward. "And Captain Holloway, he was reported ill," but Doctor's lips pressed into a grim line. "Captain Holloway passed at dawn." The words landed like a hammer. Olivia tensed. Ethan exhaled sharply. "And Miss Logan, still alive but barely. Oddly enough, the poison seems to have had a reduced effect on her." Dr. Burton adjusted his spectacles. "I will share the analysis results once I have them. Until then, Miss Sterling can provide further details." The door creaked again. A young woman entered, tall, with striking blue eyes and a composed expression. She held herself with quiet authority. "Miss Sterling," Ethan greeted. "We need details. Where did the fig paste come from?" "A special order from a London delicacy shop. We've had it before, but this batch..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "No one suspected anything was different. I never eat figs, so I didn't touch it. But Dennis..." Her voice faltered. "He was out for tea. I don't understand how he..." Ethan felt Olivia subtly press his arm. A silent cue. "What time did he return?" he asked. She hesitated. "I'm not certain." Ethan exchanged a glance with Olivia. This case was far from straightforward, and somewhere in this house, the real threat lurked, watching, waiting. The grand old manor loomed under the weight of an unsettling silence. The air carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves against the stained glass windows. Detective James Holloway studied Miss Evelyn Carrington's anxious face as she clutched her trembling hands together. "You don't think there's been foul play, do you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, her green eyes glinting with a mix of fear and desperation. James didn't answer immediately. He merely watched as she turned away, stepping onto the dimly lit terrace, where the garden stretched out into the shadows. He exchanged a glance with his partner, Claire Monroe. "Take the house staff," he murmured. "I'll check the kitchen." They split up. Within half an hour, they reconvened, their expressions tense. The tea sandwiches were untouched, except for the one that the maid, Alice, ate. She collapsed minutes later, but Claire paused. The victim, Mr. Radcliffe, wasn't at tea. He came in much later. James frowned. "Then how did he get poisoned?" Claire pulled a small delicate glass from her coat pocket. "He had a drink in the library, a single cocktail. The housemaid was just about to wash this when I stopped her." James took the glass, his expression hardening. "We need Dr. Miller to analyze this." But before he could pocket the evidence, Claire grabbed his arm. "You need to see Hannah," she said. "Something is very wrong with her." Upstairs in a small dimly lit room, the maid sat unnervingly still. An old worn Bible rested open on her lap. She rocked slightly, her voice a low eerie chant. "Let fire and brimstone rain upon them. Let the wicked perish in their own sins." James took a step closer. "Hannah, can you hear me?" The woman's head snapped up, her pupils dilated. "The time is near," she hissed. "I am the wrath of the Lord, the wicked shall burn." James felt a chill creep up his spine. He exchanged a glance with Claire, who gestured toward a book lying open on the table. He picked it up, his brows furrowing. "Advanced Toxicology and Poisonous Compounds," he read aloud. Claire leaned in, whispering, "That book doesn't belong to a maid." James pocketed it. "We need to talk to Miss Logan." The frail old woman lay in her bed, her once sharp features lined with suffering. "That book," she murmured, when James showed it to her. "It belonged to my father, a brilliant chemist, but I lent it to Mary. She was always fascinated by herbal remedies, often experimenting in my private kitchen." James stiffened. Who else had access to that kitchen? Miss Logan hesitated. "Only Mary, and Hannah, when she boiled water for our tea." James and Claire exchanged knowing glances. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit, but the final picture was still blurred, and if they didn't solve it soon, another life would be at stake. As Detective Adrian Graves stepped into the dimly lit corridor of Blackwood Manor, the air felt thick with an unsettling stillness. The ancient wooden floor creaked under his weight, and the flickering candlelight cast distorted shadows along the peeling wallpaper. He had been summoned to investigate the death of Eleanor Finch, the reclusive owner of the estate, found lifeless in her study with a peculiar vial clutched in her frail hand. A faint trace of an unfamiliar, acrid scent still lingered in the air. His keen eyes darted toward the grand bookshelf lining the walls, where a small gap between the dust-covered tomes caught his attention. He reached for the displaced book, The Art of Herbal Toxins, a medical compendium filled with knowledge far beyond the understanding of a mere household staff member. The name scribbled on the inside cover read, Jonathan Finch. His mind raced. Eleanor had no living relatives. Who then had owned this book? He turned as a quiet rustle echoed from the doorway. There stood Margaret, the housekeeper, her wrinkled hands clasped tightly together, her expression eerily composed. "You shouldn't touch Miss Eleanor's things, detective," she murmured. Graves narrowed his gaze. "Strange reading for an old woman, wouldn't you say?" Margaret hesitated. She was always fascinated by such things. Experimented in the private kitchen behind the greenhouse. Herbal brews, tinctures. She claimed to be continuing her father's work. A cold realization gripped him. Eleanor hadn't been a helpless old woman. She had been a chemist of sorts, one who understood poisons. But then why would she poison herself, or had someone merely used her own knowledge against her? As he stepped into the hidden kitchen, the scent of dried herbs and burnt residue filled his nostrils. A kettle rested on the stove, its contents reduced to a thick dark sludge. Beside it, a teacup, half drunk. He swirled the remains, noticing a faint shimmer in the liquid. Poison. But Eleanor wasn't the only one who drank it. A muffled cough from the hallway made him spin around. Margaret stood there, clutching her throat, eyes widening in horror. She staggered forward before collapsing to the ground. Graves knelt beside her, his mind spinning. Had she been the intended target all along, or was she merely another pawn in a twisted game where death lurked in every cup? The case had just taken a darker turn. The wind howled through the towering trees, rustling the ancient branches like whispers of unseen ghosts. Detective Jonathan Cross adjusted his coat as he stepped onto the damp cobblestone path leading to the Whitmore estate, his keen eyes scanning the grand yet eerily silent mansion. Inside, an air of unease clung to the walls. Lady Eleanor Whitmore had been found lifeless in her study, her expression frozen in a mix of shock and horror. Beside her hand lay a single pressed jasmine flower, its petals unnaturally crimson-stained. "A warning," murmured Cross, kneeling beside the body. "Or a signature." The case was twisted before it even began. The estate's inhabitants, Lady Eleanor's estranged niece Clara, the elusive butler Mr. Graves, the visiting historian Dr. Everett, and the quiet yet calculating maid Lillian, each harbored their own secrets. As Cross examined the room, his sharp gaze fell upon a crystal glass, its rim coated with an almost imperceptible sheen. Poison, perhaps. The thought was cut short as a distant grandfather clock chimed, the deep echoes crawling through the halls like unseen fingers. Suddenly a scream shattered the silence. Another victim had fallen. The race against time had begun. With each passing hour, the pieces of the puzzle twisted into an impossible shape. false leads intertwining with deeper conspiracies. A hidden journal in Lady Eleanor's library hinted at a past betrayal, and a coded letter concealed in the frame of an old portrait revealed a name thought long buried. As Cross navigated the labyrinth of deceit, he realized the killer was always one step ahead, anticipating every move. The mansion's secrets ran deeper than anyone had imagined, and soon, even Cross wasn't sure if he was the hunter or the prey. Tuppence's fingers tightened around the worn leather book as she read, her eyes darting over the words with feverish intensity. She barely noticed the cold night air, or the way Tommy's steady hand guided her as they walked. Suddenly she snapped the book shut with a decisive clap. They had reached the house again. "Tommy, this time you let me handle it," she said, her voice low but firm. "I see it now, it all makes sense." Tommy, sensing the gravity in her tone, gave a slow nod. "You're in command, Captain." Without hesitation, Tuppence rushed inside, her footsteps echoing off the wooden floor as she climbed the stairs 2 at a time. She rapped sharply on Miss Logan's door and stepped in without waiting for an invitation. The room smelled of old books and something faintly metallic. The elderly woman sat upright in bed, her keen eyes studying Tuppence with amusement. "My dear, you look quite determined. Have you discovered something?" she asked, her voice deceptively warm. Tuppence exhaled sharply. "Yes, I have, and I think you already know what I'm going to say." A flicker of something, surprise, irritation, or perhaps calculation, passed over Miss Logan's face. Tuppence pressed on. "You see, I might be young, but I was a nurse during the war. I know about serum therapeutics. I know how Requiem works. You injected yourself with microdoses to build immunity over time. Then when the poison was slipped into the drinks, you played the victim alongside the others, knowing you'd survive while Lois wouldn't. That way Dennis inherited her fortune first, and at his death it would come straight to you, his next of kin. Quite a brilliant plan, Miss Logan." For a moment the old woman simply stared at her, unblinking. Then, ever so slowly, a thin, chilling smile spread across her face. "Clever girl," she murmured. Before Tuppence could react, the adjoining door burst open. A wild figure emerged. Hannah, the maid, her eyes burning with unhinged fury. In her trembling hands, she clutched a flaming torch. "The wicked shall perish," she shrieked. "The fire of judgment will consume them." She lunged toward the bed, the torch licking dangerously close to the curtains. Tuppence sprang forward, grappling with Hannah's wrist, trying to wrestle the fire away, but the mad woman was strong, too strong. Tommy dashed in from the hallway, just as the flames ignited the bed hangings. He tore them down, smothering the fire with a heavy rug, while Tuppence managed to knock the torch from Hannah's grip, sending it rolling across the floor in a trail of embers. The struggle was brief but violent. Hannah clawed and thrashed, until at last they subdued her. Dr. Burton arrived in the midst of the chaos, his breath short as he took in the scene. He hurried to Miss Logan's bedside, lifted her wrist, then shook his head grimly. "The shock was too much," he muttered. "She's gone, perhaps for the best." Then he frowned, picking up an empty glass from the nightstand. There was Requiem in her drink as well. Tommy let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "A fitting end for a woman who played with poison," he said. "Tuppence, you were brilliant." Tuppence, still shaken, tried to smile but failed. "Brilliant," she repeated, her voice quieter now. "I don't feel brilliant. I feel tired." She looked at the burnt remains of the curtains, the overturned chair, and the lifeless figure in the bed. "Mystery solving isn't always fun, is it?" Tommy pulled her into a light embrace, the warmth of his presence grounding her. "No," he admitted, "but you still did what had to be done." Tuppence sighed. "I suppose so." Then, forcing a weak smile, she added, to quote an old saying, "It's a great advantage to be intelligent, and not to look it." Tommy chuckled. "You're impossible. That's why you like me," she teased. And with that they left the room, stepping out into the cold night, where the mystery had finally reached its end.